Hi everyone, this is Trish the Beekeeper. This is a presentation about first inspections and what to think about. Wear your veil, even if you're just going to lift the lid. That's when a lot of people are like, oh, I'm just going to change out the sugar syrup. Yeah, there's definitely bees up in that top box where the sugar syrup containers are. Yeah, just wear your veil. Anytime you're going to the bee yard, you can always take it off if you're just walking around out there. Just wear your veil. Okay, so now on to the presentation. And it is this one. Okay, and let's put it on slideshow. This is live, so you get to see all the bloopers. Woohoo! So you've installed your package or your nuke. Your baby is growing. What does that? What is good progress look like? Well, the bees. There's a pattern to the way the bees draw out the frames when they're being fed the sugar syrup. They're drawing them out with wax, making the lovely honeycomb. They do not draw out unless they have a steady nectar flow. It's like when people are renovating or think about remodeling a house. They're only going to do this when they've had a steady paycheck for a while, made up and almost accumulated a savings. And they have no more room to store this nectar flow. Okay, so that's not for people, that's for bees. But that's when bees remodel, when they have a steady nectar flow and there's no more room to store it. So here is a picture from, I don't know who this person is, but I want to give them credit. It's a great picture of the wax being exuded by a honeybee who's the right age to make wax. And those flakes are taken and they're shaped into the thin and yet amazingly strong and just smart creation that is honeycomb. That is comb. And they prefer to start in the middle of the hive because the bees actually take these little flakes and they shape them with their jaws, with their mandibles. And this, I mean, if you've ever worked with beeswax at room temperature, it is not easy to manipulate. So bees have to keep the area where beeswax is being shaped quite warm. And they're going to tend to do this in the center of the hive where there's a big concentration of bees. And they tend to start in the middle of the frame. The queen prefers to lay her eggs in the center of the hive, probably because that's where the comb is available for her. And she tends to, this is an interesting rule, she starts in the center of the area of comb that's available for her. So this will be important when we think about how old a given bee is, where she is in the frame, how old she is in developing from egg to emerging. Well, if the queen is laying her eggs in the center of the frame, then that's where the oldest brood should be. So this is a healthy hive. Okay. But the weather can really throw a monkey wrench in things. So this means if it's cold out, it's going to be harder to draw out wax. So that's just natural. That's just physics. So the progress won't be as quick, but there should still be progress. And the beekeeper. So if we have some cold days or some days where it's too windy or it's rainy, even if it's warm, the bees can't bring in pollen. They aren't getting any nectar. They won't progress as fast at drawing out comb and in having the queen produce brood. So that's kind of on us. Expect to feed a quart a day, if they'll take it. And I do 2 parts sugar to 1 part water. A lot of people recommend the other 1 part sugar to 1 part water. And I will leave in the show notes scientificbeekeeping.com. There is a beekeeper there who compared how well bees draw out comb under each circumstance when it's warm out, and he found that they did very well. More sugar at one time, 2 parts sugar to 1 part water. But it's your livestock. You get to pick. I will have a whole presentation on feeding bees where I talk more about this. So you can look at that at some point whenever I get it up. All right, so that's on us to help the bees, but the weather can make it so even if you have the sugar syrup on the hive, the bees really can't do much with it. It's just too cold to suck down, and it's too cold to make a lot of progress with comb. All right, so what are we talking about here with the whole point of the queen laying eggs? Well, she lays an egg. It's an egg for day 0 to day 3. Then it turns into larvae, and this is sort of like the caterpillar stage for a butterfly. And this is a lot easier for me to see than eggs. The veil makes it really hard to see things like eggs. So the larvae are kind of milky, so it's pretty obvious once you know to look for the milky. Shiny means nectar or sugar syrup, and milky means open brood. So this is an example of shiny, which is nectar. There's no eggs in there, no larvae in there. They don't put sugar water on top of the babies. This is sort of like the chrysalis stage for a butterfly, and this is capped brood. So days 9 through 21, a bee is becoming from the larval stage into a fully fledged bee. All right, taking notes. This is important, partly because you got to realize 1 frame of brood becomes 2 frames of bees. And this happens over 2 to 3 days. Suddenly there's 2 more frames of bees. So when the hive is growing, it can grow very quickly. It can even accelerate how quickly it's growing. All right, so let's just, I'm just trying to make the case here. It's important to know what you're seeing and be able to recognize it. And it takes some time to be able to see the difference between capped honey and capped brood. What does new comb look like? It helps to know what you should expect. And it also helps to know what you should be seeing when you inspect a hive. So knowing how far you are from when that new hive was started, when the bees were installed, and to know that whatever progress you see could have been affected by the weather, and to know that there's a clock or a rule about how quickly a given set of eggs laid by the queen becomes actual bees that can contribute to the hive. So this is especially important to understand with package bees. And if you watched the package bee installation video, which anyways, I'm actually filming it next, but you get the idea. You'll be able to watch it first in real time. So you install on day 0. Really, the soonest you could possibly have eggs is on day 7, because the queen has to be released from her cage. Typically that'll be like day 2 or 3. So that's when you'd expect to see eggs. So when you go in between days 7 and 10, you want to go in on a day where the weather's good and the bees are flying. And it could be day 7, could be day 10, depending on your weather and your schedule. You expect to see some eggs in that comb. You expect to see some comb drawn out, maybe 1 frame only, but still some eggs in the comb. And then by day 14, the eggs that were laid will be just starting to be capped, just a little bit. You'll see some fat larvae and maybe some capped brood. And then by day 21, that's 14 days since those eggs were laid. Oops, I did this wrong. Actually, the capped brood is still only on day 14. The capped brood does not really show up until day 28. So you'll have 2 frames more of bees that have emerged. Oops, that's what happens when you do it live. This is a math error on my part. So this should say capped brood is maturing, and this would say 2 frames here that would have emerged. So these eggs emerge in 21 days. Okay, but you get the idea. It can take this long from when you install the queen until day 28 before you see fresh bees from that queen, who are replacing the foragers who are being lost. When they go out and forage, they sometimes don't come back. All right, if you have a new hive, then it's a little different because you already have capped brood on day 0. Day 7, a lot of that capped brood will have emerged. You'll have at least 2 more frames of bees. By day 14, you'll have a total of 4 new frames of bees on top of the 5 frames of bees you got with your nuke. That's 9. You're probably ready for a new box at day 14, definitely by day 21. That's 3 weeks. You better be ready. Things go a lot faster when you get a nuke. All right. So watching the entrance, this is the best part of beekeeping as far as I'm concerned some days. And they will fly when it's as cool as 45, as long as there's some sun, it's not drippy wet. They don't handle being wet and cold very well at all. And when it's cloudy, they won't come out sometimes as when it's as cool. And what will they be doing? They'll be collecting pollen. Here is a picture. Oh, excuse me. Here is a picture of a forager with her legs with their pollen baskets full. And here's another one. It's fun to take pictures of bees on their way back from a trip. Collecting something. This is some sort of tree pollen. Looking at the color, it might be maple or probably maple tree pollen. That's like a grayish yellow. They could be collecting nectar or water. So this one that's coming in, I think her abdomen is a little fatter than it would have been. And this time of year, when there's tree pollen aplenty, there's sometimes not a lot of nectar. So she might only have water, and they use that to dilute honey so they can feed this sugar mix to the baby bees, to the larvae. This is a dish I have out. It's a couple of inches tall, and it's got plenty of landing places. And you can see there's a few bees here. And then here's another dish, also just a few inches. A lot of landing places and lots of bees. So I found that the bees really prefer to land on something that's only a few inches off the ground that has a lot of landing places that are never wet. And I really like having a water source out for the bees, partly because my neighbors all have pools and there's no creek or pond nearby. I don't want to have nuisance bees, but also because I can kind of gauge what's going on in the hive. Here, these bees, this was a chilly day, I think, or this was maybe a fall day. So they're sucking up all this water, and let's say it was a fall day and it wasn't that hot out. Well, they're using that to dilute honey to feed to baby bees because they have to dilute honey before they feed it to larvae. All right, so that's useful to know. And when they're collecting pollen, this is just a rule. They're feeding some sort of brood. And that's always a good thing to see. So a queen right hive, they'll take pollen every chance they can in the spring when the hive's growing like crazy in population, but they won't necessarily do that. They only seem to need to collect pollen for like an hour in the summer. So like between like 8:30 and 9:30, and then they're done collecting pollen. Or in the morning. And then sometimes like from 7 to 8 p.m., they'll collect pollen. If it rained the day before, they'll have extra pollen they need to collect to make up for it. And I can count the foragers while I count to 10. I kind of lift a thumb mentally for every 5 that come in. And 15 and 10 seconds is a pretty strong foraging. I've seen as high as 20 in 10 seconds, which is 120 bees a minute coming into the hive. So when the weather's good and there's something to go get, you'll see a lot of foragers in a queen right hive. So, because they're motivated. If there isn't a queen, there isn't brood. Perhaps this is a hive that swarmed 2 weeks ago. All the cat brood has emerged. There's no hungry larvae to feed. There might be 1 in 10 with pollen, but it won't really go over that ever. And then you might have 10 foragers in 10 seconds, but usually it's less. Foraging is risky business for bees. So if they don't have to go out, they won't. Now, this is where it gets tricky with understanding what the entrance activity is telling you. A hive that has lost its queen can still raise larvae. Worker bees eventually, their bodies can change after about 21 days without having a queen or brood in the hive. They will lay eggs, and those eggs will become drone brood only. And they will bring in pollen to feed the drone brood. You know, I'm not sure how often. Yeah, actually, no, they can bring in a fair amount of pollen with drone brood, especially a smaller hive. And there will still be a fair number of foragers. They have some sort of larvae to feed. So this can be something where entrance activity can fool you and is not a substitution for going into the hive every 7 to 14 days. I like to note the incoming traffic. It's helped me learn to see the rhythms of the hive. But there's some limitations, a fair number of limitations. You can be fooled into thinking you have a good queen and find it's a nasty surprise. The few days or the day before a hive swarmed, it wasn't any different. It was different after the hive swarmed. There was actually like half as much traffic. So if I'd been counting carefully, I would really have been able to see a difference. I have seen a hive with problems have low numbers of bees coming in. And that's problems that build over many days or weeks. So when there's a hive with very few bees, you will see low traffic, but that it takes like a month before there's really a difference. Because the bees will ramp up the number of foragers who go out as their population dwindles sometimes when they are trying to bring in pollen and nectar for brood. Okay, so part of your first month includes inspecting the hive. So this is where I start by, it kind of gets me in the frame of mind. I look at the entrance traffic and spend a little while, maybe a minute or so watching it. And then I pull off the lid and the feeder box. So when I'm doing this, I'm taking every effort to not be like a bear, to not scrape, to not bang. I'm going to have to pry things apart, but I'm trying to be quiet and not stimulate the bees because they can't hear speaking or loud bangs that are like far away, but they can feel vibrations. So when I bring up the inner cover, I do so with as little scraping and banging as possible. And I don't even usually smoke the hive at this point. I definitely don't smoke the entrance because that's going to push the bees up. I don't want more bees near the top of the hive. I'd like them to stay lower and closer to the entrance, away from where I'm messing with things. So I do have my smoker lit before I even pull off the lid, but I don't use it until I need to herd the bees away from wherever I'm working. So for a new hive, first month, you're not going to need the smoker to push them away from the inner cover where you're working. You might need it later in the inspection. We'll talk about that in a minute. And at this point, I have an inspection sheet, which I'm going to show you after I discuss this. And on it, it has a entry for the cluster size. And this, especially for a growing hive, is a really good thing to pay attention to. For a package install, you're going to find the cluster size stays the same for about a month or goes down. There's no new bees emerging for 28 days. Starting on day 28, you'll have your first set of bees emerging. By day 30, you will see a slight increase in the size of the cluster so that it's covering more than 5 frames. And it's going to tend to be towards the center of the hive or maybe a little bit towards one side, depending on where they started to draw comb. For a nuke, it's going to be 5 frames. And then your next visit 7 days later, it's going to be 6 frames. And then your next visit 7 days later, it might be as many as 8 or 9 frames. And that typically reflects how much comb is drawn out. If you see 5 frames covered with bees, there's not going to be comb on the outer frames. They won't have drawn any out, really. But there will be where the bees are. Okay, so here we're going to pause our presentation and switch to video because I want to show you a little bit about inspection technique. Okay, so you guys are seeing my screen. So now I'm going to have it be on camera and you can see this is a honey super, and we're going to pretend inner cover. So, when you're inspecting, you're going to want to be, like if the entrance is the bees flying this way, the inner cover will have a notch. It's facing this way. You're going to want to be towards the back or the side, not inspecting the hive from the front. And then I'll just show you here. The hive tool has a sharp end usually, and it needs to be wedged underneath the inner cover, and then you have to push it up. And I'm trying to do this as quietly as I can with the bees, and then I'll get my hand under here. I wear nitrile gloves. I really like that. Do not use the goat skin gloves. They are good for pruning roses. So then I'll set my hive tool aside, and then the inner cover might have bees on it. You can tap like this really sharply. Helps to not have your hand holding on the bottom really sharply. And then I would put this by the front of the hive, but not blocking the front, like this way. But I'm not going to actually put it on my bed because there's propolis on it. So that, I don't just set it somewhere random. I put it where the bees that are on that inner cover can crawl into the hive. Okay, so then I'm tilting this so you can see, but let's pretend I'm not, and it's flat. So I will use my hive tool. I'll press right between the ears here, and I'll wedge this frame towards the outside. And then I actually like to use a frame lifter for the very first frame, just the first one. And then when I'm lifting it out, I don't want to scrape at all on the sides or the frames. I'm pulling it out as steadily as I can. And okay, so how do I choose which frame to pull out? Well, here's how I choose. If the cluster is just right here, because it's just the 5 frames of bees, then I'm going to typically start at the one that has the least amount of bees. And I'll use my hive tool and I'll just pull out a pretty empty frame, tap the bees off, put it on top of the inner cover. And then I use my hive tool. Typically the bees have stuck things together. Actually, this is easier. And I'm going to stick it in between the ears here and just pry it apart, pry it here. And here I just use my fingers to lift it out. I do not use the frame gripper anymore when I have room to get my fingers in. And then I'm lifting this out carefully without scraping. I'm looking at it and I put it back, and I'll look at 2 or 3 frames before I take notes, but then I take notes. I don't try and remember everything. So for your first inspections, I'm expecting these outer frames, if the cluster is like, I'll pull this frame out to show. If the cluster was here, then these outer frames are going to have the honey and the pollen. So then I'll pull this out and confirm that. And I'll remember which frame is it. 1, 2, okay, frame number 3, honey pollen, okay. And then after I pull it out, I put it back in and I just move it over to the side. It's not going to stay in this position. I'm going to put the original frame back over here. Oops, no, not there. Back over here where it was. So this one will have to be put back. But for now, I'm just moving it over, and then I kind of tilt this one out, pull it out. I'm looking, oh, look, there's eggs on this one. Well, I'm done. There's eggs. The queen's doing well. I don't need to keep going. I've seen what I need to. The queen is still in there doing well. I'm going to put the hive back together. When I push these ears together, I kind of sometimes do this if there's bees on here to get them out of the way. And then I put everything back the way it was. And put the inner cover on and the lid and all that good stuff. Okay, back to the presentation. So, come on, slideshow. All right. Oh, and see, this is why I have things written down, so I remember to say them. I move like I'm underwater. Naturally, I tend to try to talk with my hands and kind of fling a little bit. And I'm very careful not to do that when I am hovering over a beehive. The bees can interpret it as a creature that is trying to get in at them. So, and I also found wearing black gloves is a really good way to do an experiment in evaluating how defensive a hive is. The more defensive the hive, the less they're going to like the black gloves. But no hive likes black gloves. So don't buy black nitrile gloves. I wouldn't get navy blue or red either. Those might be interpreted as black by the bee's eyes. They don't see color quite the same way we do. Okay. And I work hard to avoid crushing or rolling bees. It's good karma, but it's also good because then they don't release the pheromone that triggers defensiveness. And bees are kind of like rubberneckers, like at some sort of crisis with people. You get people clustering more and more. Hey, what's going on? If you crush a bee when you're like putting 2 frames back together or putting a frame back in, lots of bees will cluster around that. And this is where I would use a smoker. For the most part, with a new hive, the first couple months, you're not going to need the smoker at all. But I still light it just because if, I drop a frame or something, it really helps to reduce the defensive response of the bees. Okay. And then, if the bees are clustered by some corners of the frames where I'm pushing them apart, a few gentle puffs of smoke and then waiting like a count of 5, they'll slowly move out of the way. And always remember, don't just pull a frame from the middle. The queen could be suspended between the frames and she could be twisted or hurt by that. And plus, it's just going to stress out a lot of bees. And then they're going to make it your problem. All right. And I like to have a feeder box, which is, I like to use the feeder box as like a quiet box, where you can take that outer frame, there's not much on there, just set it on the inner cover, which is tilted against the front of the hive, or you could just move that frame and put it in a box where nothing's really happening and it's quiet. So if there's bees on there, they'll just hang out. And you don't want to just put it flat in the ground if it's a frame without much on it, because you can't step on it. And that's a very sad thing. A lot of work went into that frame. Here's an example of an inspection sheet. So, how much traffic was there? How much pollen was coming in? This reminds you to look at that, because inspecting a hive is a very multi-sensory experience, and having a guide about what you should be looking at can really be helpful. Whether or not you see drones, this especially becomes important. Maybe more your second year when you're thinking about splitting and when would be a good time of that. You need to have drones flying, whether or not they're taking water, how many frames are covered on top. It's good to pay attention to the cap worker brood pattern. Is it solid? Remember the queen, oops. Cool, I can go back. The queen should be starting to lay in the center of the frame and then spiraling out. If there's cap brood surrounded by empty cells kind of all through the frame, there's a problem. There's a problem, and you should call another beekeeper who's been doing it for a while to talk about it. And we'll talk about this at another time when I talk about summer inspections, but it's good to get familiar with what nectar in a frame looks like and make a note of it. So for a package, you might just put an H. See, I have a little key here of the abbreviations I use because I'm not writing the word honey in here. So, I would actually put a bar through here because I wouldn't have the top box with frames yet for a new install. I would have maybe a note that there's honey here, and then there were eggs here, like in the example mock inspection I did. And then I would draw on the very top of my representation of a box. There we go. I would draw kind of a circle to show about how many frames were covered with bees. And I found this inspection sheet, this kind of style of inspecting where I'm really noting the details, really trained me about the patterns you would expect for the distribution of bees and new comb and brood. And it was good reminder think about what needs to be done, what was done recently that might affect this. And I always need this reminder, okay, how many days is a queen uncapped? If I see a queen cell, how long until she emerges? So these sort of reminders were very helpful for me. I won't emphasize them with this talk. I have another one. I think it's class 4 or 5 where I talk about it more. So at some point I'll put it in the show notes. But at any rate, this is shorthand for the queen, how many days she's open brood, how many days her queen cell is capped, when she's out, and how long usually until she starts to lay. This part is very weather dependent. This part is not. Worker brood, 9 days open brood, 12 days is cap brood, 3 weeks until they're out, and foraging, typically it can vary by a little bit, especially if there's few bees in the hive. This is a much shorter inspection sheet if that's more your preference. How many frames are covered, how many frames are drawn out, especially with a growing hive. How many frames have eggs, or whether or not you saw eggs and what frame number, whether or not you saw cap brood and what frame number. You don't have to look at every single frame to get an answer. Is the queen doing okay? That means there's eggs, larvae, and cap brood. Brood in all stages. She's been laying continuously since the last time you saw her. That's an okay hive. If you did something, like swap some frames or something, good to make a mention of that. If you had a thought, I should do this, good to write that down. Of course, then it's good to check that later, and this is where, your next inspection can be on the same sheet. And then it's easy to see, what do I have to do? Oh yeah, I wrote it down. So here we go. You can download these from chickabuzz.com. You can make up your own. You can find other people's. I just found it's helpful because I think I'll remember something. And then I walk away and I realize, oh, I don't remember. And it's also helpful because it draws my attention to what needs to be noted. Blanks on the sheet are the kinds of things I should pay attention to. So if it's there, that helps guide my inspections. You can make up your own. Totally. I just use PowerPoint to draw the shapes for the frames. Total pain in the butt, but it can be done. All right. And just got to mention here, your first inspection should not be your first visit. Because you should be feeding a quart a day or 4 quarts per half week, 2 gallons a week. If the bees will take it, feed them that much. And wear your veil when you go to feed them. Trust me. For every, 10 trips you go and there's no problem, you're going to have that one trip that's going to remind you, yeah, they're bees. And they're not sure if you're a bear. They don't really realize you're an angel bringing them sugar syrup. Wear your veil if you're popping the lid. And it's good to go into your first inspection. What do you expect? What should you be seeing? So we're actually going to walk through kind of a cartoon of how a package hive, in this case, would look through the course of a month. So on day 7, you might only have 3 frames partially drawn out. The queen was released maybe 3-4 days ago. And this skin color is my representation of eggs in open brood. And this yellow is honey. And this is like a side view as though there was a piece of glass. And you open up the side of the hive and you can see through the glass what's going on the frames. Or I guess it could be a top view. It's kind of symmetric, but Okay, so day 14, they may have added some comb to that first frame they had eggs on, but that first frame now has the first stages of capped brood. It's kind of a lighter brown color, hence I chose this color. The frame that had honey before now has eggs. And there's an additional frame that has been drawn out. Maybe they've drawn out some more than this. You were feeding really well and it's been warm. This is kind of the minimum. They will try to make progress as best they can. All right, so now we have day 28. This is when they have the first capped brood that's pretty ready to emerge very soon. You've got more eggs and more frames drawn out. Okay, now we get to the point where the hive looks more like a nuke. And a nuke will have 2 frames with stores and 3 frames with brood. So it's day 31 for the package, day 1 for a nuke. Because a nuke starts with a queen who's fully functional and already laying. Well, a package starts with a queen she's fully functional, but when you separate her from a hive, from bees feeding her like they mean it, her egg laying shuts down. It takes like a day or 2 to start up again. Okay, so then a week after you install your nuke, or after your package looks like a nuke, there's still going to be more comb drawn out, but not a lot. And the queen may not have started to lay there yet, but you do expect to see some comb drawn out, and you definitely should see eggs. So by day 14 or 44, so this is a week after our prior inspection, we're starting to see a lot of frames drawn out. And notice I made like a sphere. So the frame is going to be partially drawn out on the outside, and then they'll finish it the following week, and it'll look more, this frame will look more like this. And the new comb tends to be where the eggs go. Okay, what about frames covered with bees? These bars represent what's on the frame. They don't represent how many bees are on the frame. Well, you got to remember, we've had 1 frame of brood emerge by this point. So you have 2 more frames covered with bees. So then when you, this is a good point to shuffle the frames. The bees do not like to draw out the outer frames. So give them a drawn frame, swap in a partially drawn frame, continue to feed them, and they will draw out these frames really well and draw out every frame really well in their box, which is good because you need all those frames. And when the bees are at this point where you just have 2-3 frames that aren't drawn, you've got at least 7-8 frames really covered with bees, you're going to be adding the next box. You could add it now if the weather will continue good and it might be a while before you get back, Or you could wait like 5 days or 7 days at the most. So you get to day 21, they have almost every frame drawn out. They've got brood. Oh my goodness. So this is going to become, so you got 10 frames covered with bees right now. This becomes 12 frames. This one contributes to 14 frames to get the hive to be 14 frames covered with bees. And 7 days later, you'll be at frame 16, and then frame 18 almost a day or two later. So you're going to be covering 2 boxes within like a week of putting on your second box. So the hive will grow quickly. But what if after you visit, when you visit your first visit, you really don't see much comb, and there's not much of an increase in comb the second visit after 7 days or 10 days? What should you think? What if there aren't any eggs until after day 21 or later? Some of the answer to that is, what's the weather been like? Has it been poor weather and you're not feeding, or you're feeding sugar syrup, but it's even too cold for them to suck it down, so it just sits there and there's no pollen patty available to them? Well, this is what you might see. A very slow increase in the amount of drawn comb, and the queen doesn't lay until day 21 or later. But yeah, so is the beekeeper supporting the hive? The best fix for this situation, if you had 2 hives and one hive is really lagging, the other one's doing really well, give the lagging hive a frame of eggs and larvae or open brood. You do not want to get this from another apiary. You want to get this from your apiary. If you only have one hive, that's a little more complicated. You're going to want to talk to someone in your club for some help. And definitely wait to buy a queen. It's really easy to buy a queen, put her in a hive, and have her get killed because there's already a queen and you just didn't realize it. So take your time with that purchase. Definitely do that with support. All right. If you see a queen cell, I should have put a picture in. Well, you can Google queen cell and find a picture. It really looks like a peanut pasted to the side of the comb. 1 or 2 means the hive is unhappy with their queen. They are not going to change their mind if you cut those queen cells out. They're just going to do it again. Just let them go, unless you're at like the 3rd week with your package bees and the number of bees has dwindled. Then you should probably just buy a queen and talk to whoever you're buying the queen from for some serious instructions on how to get that queen be accepted. I found that when there's more like 3 or 4 frames of bees and they're not super well covered, the bees just cannot support feeding the queens well enough, and then that queen's just going to get superseded after she starts laying. So there's like a lower limit. If there's more like 3 to 4 on a frame on multiple frames, well, swarmy. You might have a hive that is being fed, didn't draw out all their comb, and feels like, oh, we're out of room. Let's go, girls. So you can kind of halt the urge, but only if the queen cells are uncapped and they have eggs in them or like some goo that's not very far along. You can cut those off, and that's hard. You actually, if it's really a populous hive, just 1 box, I'm assuming, but because we're talking about the first month, it's just 1 box. You might have to like shake the bees off, which is kind of freaky. Or just take your time and like move them out of the way with your hive tool to look at any suspicious clumps. And we'll talk about how to interrupt the brood nest in a minute. If the queen cells are capped and you don't see any eggs, cut out all but 2. So if you have a lot of queen cells in a populous hive, sometimes there'll be an after swarm, another swarm with another virgin queen, and you don't want to lose bees. If you're not sure what's going on, just interrupt the brood nest when you're at the first month and you've got a populous hive and there's brood. So what does that mean? So the hive looks like this and there's queen cells. Well, maybe you didn't put on the next box in time, or maybe they have a swarmy tendency and this is never going to get better. Well, let's just keep them in the box for now. And what you do is you take some of the frames and you move them up. Always keep 2 brood frames together. Try to have honey on both sides of the brood frames up top. And this is the top box. So the box below, well, You can separate this brood here and put in an undrawn frame that will help encourage them to draw this out more, or keep these together and put these on the outside and keep feeding them because you need them to draw comb. And this is the time to catch problems during this first 4 weeks and then deal with them. Well, thanks for watching. Happy bee watching. I hope you are enjoying your bees now or able to enjoy them soon. And chickabuzz.com is my website. I've got more stuff about newbie thoughts and tips and tricks. And you can leave a comment here or go to the club website for my email if you're from my club, my bee club. And if you're not, then please find your bee club, check them out, give them a chance, and maybe you'll be able to find someone nearby who can help. All right, take care. Have a good night. It's going to take me a minute to end stream. Oh, there's the button. All right, seriously, goodbye. Oh, yes, I'm sure.